You know, in 1969, because of the growth in the Worldwide Church of God, they decided to have a feast site in Canada, in Penticton. And it's actually only about 9 miles from where I currently live. But at the time, I mean, I was living down the coast about 250 miles away. And it was the first one, I believe, in Canada at the time. So they had the feast inside this huge tent that they brought up from Big Sandy, Texas. Something like over 8,000 people were attending there. I mean, it was just a huge tent, a huge congregation. And it was really almost overwhelming for the city because the city didn't have that high a population, and you get 8,000 people show up. I mean, it was really quite something. I mean, you'd go to a restaurant with your family, and you'd have to wait an hour before you even sat down. And then you had to wait an hour for your meal to show up. But nobody ever complained. We just took it all in stride. It was just part of how it was with such a big group. And in fact, there was too many people to be in the city. We occupied basically all the hotels, and then some brethren were placed in hotels south of Penticton and OK Falls, and some even as much as 30 miles north in Kelowna, and hotels in between. So it was kind of overwhelming for the people there. But the merchants didn't complain, obviously. Every day was a sellout. Every restaurant was just beaming, all the money they made. But because it was a first site, and the tent was there for something like 6 years, Mr. Armstrong would come and open the feast, and he would, at that time, travel maybe 2 or 3 feast sites, but he'd show up at Penticton, and he'd ask the question, why are you here? He'd pose that question, and that is the question I want to address today. Why would you travel 1,000 miles or more, as some of us have, to come here to listen to sermons and participate in other activities? Well, I want to go over some of the reasons why. So the title of my sermon is The Big Question. And I've been told to keep it short today, so I'll try to do my best. Anyway, let's look at the Bible and find some answers. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is it's commanded by God. Let's turn over to Leviticus 23. And we'll begin in verse 1 of Leviticus 23. And it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," in verse 2, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." And in verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is a Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And going on in verse 4, "These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their appointed times." So notice, these are the feasts of the Lord. They're God's feast. They're not some festival conjured up by man or commanded by others. It's God commanded them, and they're instituted by God. And they are proclaimed at their appointed times. And of course, we use the Hebrew calendar to determine when the holy days are, which this is. It's considered a Sabbath, annual Sabbath, and commanded by God. This is the 6th festival of God's plan, you might say. The Feast of Tabernacles to be kept for 7 days, 7 being the number of completion, which pictures the millennium and rulership of Christ over the earth for 1,000 years. Now, it's all part of God's plan, because God has a plan, and every holy day represents a certain aspect of that plan, and it's like a puzzle, the pieces all fit in, and they fit in perfectly. Since you're in Leviticus 23, I'd like to go over to verse 44. it says, so Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of the Lord. So here again it qualifies and emphasizes that these are the feasts of the Lord. And like I said, it's part of God's plan, and it's precise and on time and everything according to his will. And I was talking to Eric the other day. We were talking about the subject about how things, God plans are always precise and on time. And I was telling him that I had a station, not a station wagon, but a van. It was a Plymouth van that I wanted to sell because I had found a really good deal on another Plymouth van, which was a little less mileage. So I put it out at the road, and a young couple came by, and they wanted to buy it. And she had about 3 or 4, maybe more, 4 or 5 kids from a previous marriage, and she was also pregnant for another child. And of course, this van would have been suitable for them. So I sold it to them, but he was telling me that although he would have preferred an 8-seat van, mine was only a 7-seat because it's a minivan. And the 8-seaters are quite a bit larger, and they're a little more expensive to operate gas-wise. So I said, I'll see what I can do if I could find something for you, because the 7-seats van, they have a bench seat right behind the driver, and you can take that out, and you can push the 3-seater forward, and it locks into place. And then it's a 5-passenger, and that's what I used to do when I come to the feast. I didn't need that second seat, but I could take people with me and still have lots of room for my luggage. So I said, I'll see if I could find another seat, and that way it'll be an 8-seat van, which is what you're looking for. So about two or 3 days later, I'm going to town, and I'm at a 4-way stop, and I look to the right, and this person I know that drives a dump truck, not a dump truck, but a truck to haul trucks on. He was taking a van to dispose of it up in Kelowna, and I looked, and there was a Plymouth on there, a minivan, and I thought, I wonder about this. So I he was stopped. I think he was on his cell phone. So I pulled over, and I pulled in front of him, and I knew him, and I went up and I talked to him, and I said, listen, I just sold my van. I said, could we have a look at that one to see if it's got a 3-bench seat in recent condition that I can, give it to the guy, and he'll turn the 7-seater into an 8-seater. So we went and had a look, and to my surprise, the seat was exactly the same as what I had in my van. The color was the same, the texture was the same, there wasn't a mark on it. I said, this is perfect. I says, give me a hand, we'll throw it in the back of my van. So he helped me, and I put it in the back of my van, and he didn't charge me for it because he was taking this thing to get, probably crushed. So I drove over to this couple's place, and they weren't home, so I put it in their carport. So a couple of days later, I thought I'll go back and see how, if they are using it. And I went over there, and they said, when we came home and we saw that 3-seater there, they said, Renee's been here. They knew, but they were quite happy. And of course, they didn't have to pay for it, and they landed up with their 8-seat van. So, sometimes when God intervenes in your life, the details are all worked out so precise you couldn't plan it better than that. So it's all glory to God, obviously. But I'd like to turn over to Deuteronomy 16, and we'll read verse 13. More admonition in regard to the Feast of Tabernacles. It's Deuteronomy 16:13. It says, you shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days when you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. And dropping down to verse 15, it says, 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God, and the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your work and all the work of your hands, so that you shall surely rejoice. So God blesses us for keeping the feast, is what he's saying here. And if we're faithful in doing it, we will be blessed. So going back over to Leviticus 23, read a few more scriptures there in Leviticus 23. I'd like to read verses 39 to 41. In verse 39 of Leviticus 23, It says, also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. But the 8th day is a separate feast day of itself. We know that as the last great day. Excuse me. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of the beautiful trees, branches and palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And in verse 41, you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in all your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. So he lays out the instructions as to when to keep it, what month to keep it, and the duration. Notice it's the first day is a Sabbath rest, so we keep it like the weekly Sabbath. It is to be kept in a place where God chooses, and in this age, the ministry, with input from the brethren, pick a suitable location to keep the feast every year. And this year it has been determined to have the feast here in Pismo Beach. Other times we pick other locations, and the feast in Germany is kept near Dusseldorf. I've not been there, but apparently it's really quite a nice feast location. Now these are God's feasts, holy convocations, which mean they are holy time, and annual Sabbaths. And we are to keep it for 7 days at a location determined by God through the ministry. And the things you have to consider when picking a feast site is the weather. What's the weather like? I mean, if you pick a site where you're going to be rain and snow, it's not very pleasant for the brethren. So those are considerations when the ministry looks at a location. If it's late in October, you want to come to a more southern spot like here or Arizona, where you're going to almost guarantee the weather will be nice. And of course, there's a consideration for those that are traveling to the feasts. Is it convenient for people that are traveling? I mean, I don't think anybody traveled any further than John. I mean, he beat me by a long run, but I still had to travel 1,400 miles, which is a long stretch, a long way. But these are considerations when picking a feast site. Other things to consider is restaurants. Are they close proximity? And the hotel itself, as far as convenience and having some of the hotels had a restaurant right on site. Like when we went to Idaho, they had they served you food and it was a free breakfast, but the restaurant was about 50 feet from the hotel. It couldn't have been more convenient. That was a very convenient location to have a feast. Now, all these things have to be considered. It's not like throwing a dart at a map to determine where the feast is going to be. What happens if the dart lands up in the middle of the Pacific? Uh-oh, next throw. So all these things have to be considered, when you're picking the location for the feast site. The second thing I want to talk about is we are to rejoice. Now, Deuteronomy 16, verse 14, I'd like you to turn there. Deuteronomy 16:14, and it says, "And you shall rejoice in your feasts, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates." So all those at the time that you were responsible for, I don't think too many of us have male servants today, but they were also commanded to attend the feast, and you took them along with you. Now, what are some of the ways that we can rejoice at the feast? Well, for us that are remote, you might say, and don't have regular contact with the brethren on a one-on-one basis, the fellowship with brethren, I mean, it's a real blessing. And we rejoice when we see one another. I mean, the last time I saw most of you was last year at the feast. So it's really great to come down and be with people of like-minded. You don't have to deal with the world. You deal with the world during, the other times of the year, but you come here with people of like-minded. It's really a blessing brethren, to do that and to fellowship and to talk about each other and discuss what's happened and how things are going. It's really, really a good way to rejoice. Of course, another way you rejoice is you surprising someone with a gift. I mean, that's a way of rejoicing. There's rejoice in giving. There's rejoice in receiving. And, you know, some brethren are quite generous and they exchange gifts at the feast, and that's an opportunity to participate, and it's an opportunity to rejoice. Another way of, you know, extending your generosity is pay for someone's meal at a restaurant. You know, some are not so well off, and they could use a little help, so there's an opportunity there. If someone needs a little help, pay for their meal, and that's a way for them to rejoice. Of course, we can't neglect our prayer and Bible study. Just because we're at the feast doesn't mean that we don't pray and study. We've got to do that. You know, it can't be all pleasure, brethren, and ignore God. It has to be balance, a balance of both rejoicing and keeping up our responsibilities towards God. And that way we're doing things that are pleasing to God. Notice Deuteronomy 14, and we'll read verse 24. It says, "But if the journey is too long, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God blessed you," and in verse 25, "then you shall exchange it for money, take the money in your hand, and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses." Of course, if you had a herd of cattle, it's not very practical if you're taking a portion of that and hauling them hundreds of miles. So turning into cash, it's easy to carry. And in verse 26, "And you shall spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, for sheep, for wine or similar drink, or whatever your heart desires. You shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household." So here again, we're commanded to rejoice. I mean, if you're not rejoicing, you're not obeying God. And the reason is he wants it to leave a good impression in you. I mean, there's the spiritual side, the sermons and that, but the physical side, and he wants you to rejoice in that. It just helps everything. I want to read Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5 to 7. It says, "You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things, but you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all the tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, heave offerings of the Lord, your vowed offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks." And then in verse 7, "And there you shall eat before the Lord your God. You shall rejoice," admonition once again to rejoice, "in all which you have put your hand, and you and your household in which the Lord your God has blessed you." So it's really a time of rejoicing. Over in Psalm 9, I want to go there. Over in Psalm 9, in verse 2, it says, "I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing praises to your name, O Most High." So during song services, part of the feast, we are rejoicing and praising God. And that's an opportunity to rejoice, and that is pleasing in God's sight also. Also, a few pages over in the book of Psalms, and verse 5, Psalm 13 and verse 5, it says, "But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." So we have all kinds of blessings bestowed upon us throughout the year And the song service is an opportunity to show our appreciation to God and a form of rejoicing. So God wants us to rejoice, and we should follow the admonition given to us in the Bible. Notice, it's whatever your heart desires within the confines of the Bible. I mean, obviously, you don't say, well, I want that car. It's my neighbor's, but I'm taking it. He wouldn't be happy about that. How do we get here, and what money do we use? Now, Deuteronomy 14, I have to go back there. Back to Deuteronomy 14. And in verse 22, it says, "You shall surely tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year." And if you drop down to verse 24 of Deuteronomy 14, it talks about, I mentioned this earlier, if the journey is too long so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, then when the Lord your God has blessed you. Now, let's go over to Numbers 15 for a minute. A few chapters over here. In Numbers 15. I want to read verses 1 to 3 of Numbers 15. Verse 1 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you have come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you, and you make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering or a sacrifice to fulfill a vow as a freewill offering, or as or in your appointed feast to make a sweet aroma to the Lord from the herd of the flocks." Now, this tithe is over and above the first tithe, and it's to be used for going to the feast and to pay for expenditures once we're here. And that is explained in our booklet on tithing, which I brought a copy here because I want to read out of it on page 22. It explains about this tithe that the Bible talks about. And on page 22, it explains the second tithe. I'm reading from the booklet on tithing right now. It says, "The second tithe for a second tenth of one's earnings or other income is an additional tithe of one's increase." And it quotes Deuteronomy 14, 22 to 26. Sonsino confirms that Deuteronomy 14:23 discusses the second tithe. They state, "This refers to the second tithe because the first tithe was to be given to the Levites, who were allowed to eat it anywhere." And that's mentioned in Numbers 26, verse 31. The Rye Study Bible has a similar comment pertaining to Deuteronomy 14, 22 to 27, confirming the existence of a second tithe. So does the New Bible Commentary Revised copy of 1970 on page 220. This is the so-called second tithe as contrasted with the tithe of the produce given to maintain the Levites. And of course, they quote Numbers 18, 26 to 28. The individual saves a second tithe each year for use in observing God's annual holy days, mainly the Feast of Tabernacles. As members are commanded to travel for the Feast of Tabernacle to one of God's designated feast sites. And it says, for more information, please read our free booklet, God's Commanded Holy Days. This tithe is to be saved for the use by the individual. Only excess second tithe, the portion of the second tithe exceeding necessary individual use, should be sent to the church. The church will distribute such amount to members who were unable to save sufficient second tithe for the holy days, and it might also remain It might also use remaining funds for necessary church-related feast expenses, such as hall rentals. And got to admire God when he developed, the system of tithing, because it's not complicated. I mean, it's the most system you could have. I mean, if you have $100, you move the decimal point 1 to the left. A 2-year-old could do that, and have to pay $10. And what if God said, okay, you have to pay 3.747 of your income? I mean, you need a calculator to figure out what you're going to send in. But tithes is so simple. You just move the decimal point over one thing, and there you got it. And I'm always amazed. Most people I talk to, or I've talked to in the past, says they move the decimal point over, and if there's something like 67 cents, they just round it off to the next dollar. I mean, you don't send in $94.63. But anyway, whenever I get a check from someone where it says $113.40, I know exactly what his income was. He's paying it to the penny, so it was easy to figure. But I mean, you got to admire God, the simplicity of Christ. There's nothing complicated about tithing, how to calculate it. It's just so simple. It's really amazing. And I find it amusing. Ezekiel, I'd like to go to Ezekiel 45. He has mercy on those of us that have trouble with math, how to figure your tithes. Ezekiel 45. And I want to read verse 17. Talking about King David in the millennium. Then it shall be the prince's part to give burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings at the feasts, the new moons, and the Sabbaths, and at the appointed seasons of the house of Israel. He shall prepare the sin offering, the grain offering, the burnt offerings, and the peace offerings to make atonement for the house of Israel. So here again, it's just a proof that the holy days are going to be kept in the millennium. It's not like Christ returns and we do away with all that old stuff. No, it's going to be carried forward to people on earth, and we'll be required to tithe and give offerings at that time. Another reason for what's expected of us coming to the feast is that we may learn, and it's something you learn to fear God. That's one of the purposes of coming to the feast. And again, we go back to Deuteronomy 14. And verse 23. Deuteronomy 14 says 23, and it says, "You shall eat before the Lord your God in a place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." So it's an opportunity to learn to fear God. Now, this fear is not a cowering fear where you're just shaking in your boots. No, it's a fear that, in Strong's Concordance, it's awe and respect towards God is a type of fear you have to have. That other type of fear just paralyzes your mind, and it almost makes you incapable of functioning. But the type of fear that God wants us to have is respect, awe, gratitude, that type of fear. And that type of fear is gleaned to some respect by the messages which have been prepared for you. So when you leave the feast, you're closer to God than when you came, because of this aspect of respect and awe to God. Over in Deuteronomy 8, a few chapters over, and verse 6, it states, "Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him." So here again, the keeping of the commandments teaches you to have awe and respect and gratitude towards God, which is fear. Keeping the feast is keeping his commandments, since it is a commanded assembly, an opportunity to learn to stand in awe of God. And then over in Deuteronomy 13 and verse 4, it says, "You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him." So you have to hold on to God, draw close to him, hold on to. Holding fast to him is like, it's more than a hug, it's a hug and holding on fast. And that helps us to fear God and have that respect that we need to have for him. And it's something that we can learn at this feast, because it's part of the things that we have to do is learn how to fear God. Let's turn over to Proverbs. It tells us a little bit more about fear, the right type of fear that we should have. In Proverbs, the first chapter, and verse 7, Proverbs 1:7, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Notice it's the beginning of knowledge. It's not the end, but the beginning, the very beginning. The fear of God puts you in a frame of mind where you can absorb and learn things, the things of God. And of course, we're commanded to grow in grace and knowledge, but the beginning of it is the fear of the Lord. And of course, fools hate wisdom and instruction. They don't have nothing to do with that. They don't have nothing to do with God. They don't want God to tell them what to do. I mean, that's this world today. I mean, don't tell me what to do. They reject everything God wants us to do. Over in Psalm 22 and verse 25, it says, "My praise shall be of you in the great assembly." In other words, he's praising God in the great assembly. "I will pay my vows before those who fear him." So here again, talking about fear, paying your vows to God. And you notice the praise in the great assembly, I mean, it's like we're praising God with song service, aren't we? It's the same concept that is mentioned here in verse 25. Let's go over to a few chapters, over to Proverbs now. I want to go over to Proverbs 9, and we'll read verse 10. Proverbs 9:10. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So here again, the awe and respect you have for God is the beginning of wisdom. That's the step number one. If you want to be wise, you better fear God. That's where you start. You're not wise over here. You're wise over here at the beginning. And knowledge of the Holy One is one of understanding. So those wisdom and knowledge are linked. And the beginning of those things is to have a proper fear and respect for God. It's a starting point for both wisdom and knowledge. Honor and awe and respect are aspects of fear and are the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. And I don't know anybody who goes through life saying, "I want to be a dummy." People want understanding, they want wisdom, and they want knowledge. And if you possess those things, they'll recognize that in you. They may not know where it comes from, but they'll certainly recognize it in you. Of course, the feast pictures the millennium. That's what it pictures. During the millennium, the world will learn to have a proper fear of the Lord and will enjoy peace as a result. We are meeting here in relative peace and harmony, enjoying one another and fellowshipping together, which is really great because we're kind of picturing what it's going to be like in the millennium. Turn over to Isaiah. We'll go over a few scriptures outlining some of the things that are going to happen in the millennium when Christ rules. I'm going the wrong way here. I want to start in Isaiah 65. Everybody's there and waiting for Renee. Okay, Isaiah 65, and I want to read verse 25. It says, "The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, says the Lord." So that's going to be quite a change, isn't it? You know, the nature of wild animals is going to change so that the wolf and the lamb hang together. The wolf's not going to be looking to the lamb for a meal. They'll just hang out together. And, you know, where I live, you know, we have coyotes, we have bears, raccoons. And the raccoons have, you know, over the years, they've killed a lot of my chickens and ducks. So although I'm fully fenced in, that doesn't stop the raccoon from getting at my chickens. But anyway, this friend of mine told me of something he did years ago when his neighbor kept leaving souvenirs on his lawn. He said, "I made magic meatballs." He said he took meatballs and put sleeping pills in, and the dog ate that. And of course, the dog would go to sleep for 2-3 days, and the guy would take the dog to the vet. After about the third time, the guy got rid of the dog. So he said, you know, he talked to his neighbor, and he says, "I haven't seen your dog lately." And the guy says, "Well," he says, "I had to take him to the vet. He kept falling asleep and couldn't figure out what was the matter with him, so I got rid of the dog. So I thought I'll get rid of the raccoons this way. I made some meatballs, put sleeping pills in them, and also some warfarin, some, you know, a blood thinner, so that the raccoon would go to sleep and not wake up, and that'd solve my problem, right?" So last year we had a mother bear and 3 cubs in the neighbor's yard. I mean, just on the other side of the fence. And the bears never ever bothered my chickens, although they walked through my yard and left a souvenir on the ground. They never bothered my chickens because at night during the chicken coop, they've got into my garbage cans and that. So I put out, and the raccoons were around at the same time, so I put out my magic meatballs. So next thing you know, I said to Delia, I says, "Honey, the bear ate the meatballs." And I was a bit concerned, but a bears are pretty big animals. So for 2 days, the little bears were playing in the neighbor's yard, but the mother wasn't around at all. So on the 3rd day, I said to her, "I hope it didn't kill the bear. I'd be in trouble." So on the 3rd day, Delia says to me, she says, "I heard a bunch of rustling in the bushes back there, so I know she's okay. But it must have been odd. The cubs were playing in the yard. They'd go to her mother. She's still asleep. But she was all right after that." So, you know, just one of those things, dealing with issues. But you won't have to worry about that in the millennium, about bears and raccoons killing your chickens. Let's go over to Isaiah 11. I just can't take a gun out and shoot a bear. It wouldn't be allowed. But besides, I don't have a gun. Isaiah 11 and verse 6. Here again, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat." Here again, in this age, leopards don't lie down with goats, they have them for supper. "The calf and young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." So a child can play with a lion. I mean, if you want an 800-pound gorilla for a pet, have at it. I mean, you know, you can have all kinds of animals for pets, and they're not going to hurt you, and they're not going to hurt your other pets, which is really quite something. It's really going to be something when we, you know, see that. You can have chickens. You don't have to worry about the raccoons coming over to eat them. Over in Isaiah 2, Isaiah 2 where am I? Oh, right here. Okay. I got the wrong scripture. I got. Oh, no, it's right. He shall judge, in verse 4, he shall judge between the nations. This is talking about Christ. And shall rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, in other words, they're going to turn implements of war into implements of good, like a tank can be converted with great difficulty into a tractor. And the thing about it, war, when you think about it, war is learned. From a very young age, they brainwash children to hate other children and nations against nations. And they grow up that way, having that prejudice built in. That's not going to happen anymore. They're not going to learn war anymore. They're going to learn to love other nations. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's going to be a tremendous, tremendous time for everything. I mean, just having peace, out of the, peace in the air is going to be refreshing. Over in Micah 4th chapter, I'd like to turn there. Micah 4 and verse 1. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. Many nations shall come and say, this is what they're going to say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways. They'll want to learn God's ways at that time, a total different frame of mind than we have today, where there's hostility towards God's law, there's hostility towards God's people, because Satan's the god of this world. And in verse, continuing on, it says, and we shall walk in his paths. In other words, keeping the Feast of Tabernacle, keeping the holy day, keeping the Sabbath. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, out of Jerusalem, the headquarters of the earth at that time, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many people, and rebuke strong nations from afar, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Again, stating that implements of war will be turned into useful implements. Something useful for gardening and other things that can be used. It's just going to be a total turnaround. And I mean, there's so much money. I mean, billions of dollars spent on wars. I mean, how many nuclear weapons, thousands, that Russia and the United States have? I mean, a couple would finish us all off, and they have 1,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, what do you need 1,000 nuclear bombs for? I mean, what are you trying to do? I mean, if they use them all, there would be nothing but ash all over the earth. I mean, there would be nothing left. That's going to be bad, because there would be few left, but there'd be nothing left if these maniacs were allowed to carry on what they want to do. But that's not going to happen, thankfully. Over in Zechariah 14, Zechariah 14, and I want to start in verse, as soon as I get there, verse 16. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and what? And keep Sunday and Easter? No, keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And notice it's those that are left. And in verse 17, and it shall be whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King of hosts, on them will be no rain. So even keeping, or the willingness to keep the Feast of Tabernacles and the holy days, it's not going to be automatically they want to do it. Some of them are going to resist, because those that have survived still have the memories of what it was like before, the days that they were keeping. So what's happening? They won't get no rain. So the light will come on, and they'll say, wait a minute, these other nations are being blessed with rain and good crops for going to Jerusalem. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe we should change our ways and go up there, and then we'll be blessed too. Because man is stubborn, you know, really. Man is hard-headed, and some of that stubbornness is going to be carried over, even though Satan's put away. And it goes on in verse 18, if the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague of which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So not only do they not get rain, they're going to get hit by some of the plagues that Egypt suffered. And that'll really bring them around really fast. When you have your hand in a vice, you want the person to take the pressure off. I mean, some people are just like that. You need you need to maximize the force to get the results you want. Let's go over to Revelation 20. Revelation 20 and verses 1 to 6. This is one of the things that are going to happen at the beginning of the millennium. And it's verses 1 to 3 I want to read. In Revelation 20, it says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. So you won't have Satan around, who is the current god of this age, who is the adversary. He's the enemy. He wants us to fail. He wants us to fall short. And it's like a dog in a manger. A dog can't eat the hay, but the dog will sometimes keep the sheep from getting to the hay, because that's their mentality, and that's the mentality of Satan, the devil. If he can't have his way, then he wants to destroy the whole thing. In other words, every human being. But God's only going to allow that to go so far, and then, of course, he's going to interfere and stop the madness and put Satan away. You know, he's got such a negative influence on people, and people don't realize it, you know. I mean, look at the mentality in the States, the violence. I mean, I was watching this video. I mean, it made me sick to my stomach. I was telling Eric about it. This woman was attacked in a subway station by a black man, and I mean, it could have been any color, but it happened to be black. He was kicking her in the head, constantly in the face, and then a guy came along and was going to interfere. He chased the guy away, went back and kicked her and kicked her and kicked her. Well, they had this poor woman on Tucker Carlson about 2 days later. The one eye was totally, they had sewed it together, I guess, so it could heal. And she was probably going to lose the vision in her eye, an unprovoked attack. And her good eye, you know, was 90% closed and just violent. And it's constant. I mean, a good day in Chicago is only 15 people getting shot. You know, a bad day is 25. And it's constant, and it's getting worse. And that's a sign to me that we're closer to the end time, because it's just the violence just increased so badly. It's just, you know, it's like you wake up in the morning and you can really pray fervently, your kingdom come, because it's just getting so bad. Okay. You know, the festival and what we're keeping is what eventually will be practiced in the millennium. What we're doing today is kind of a forerunner of what's going to happen in the millennium. Worshiping the true God, growing in knowledge, growing in grace, singing praises to God in song services, and having temporarily put away Satan the devil. He's going to be released at the end. That's part of God's plan for a short period of time. But during the millennium, his influence won't be there, so it'll be noticeable worldwide. Let's turn over to Isaiah 14. I don't think the world has ever known peace. I mean, you know, there's been war right from the beginning. Cain kills his brother, and it just escalated downhill from then. People will be shocked when they're living in a time of peace. But I like fighting with my neighbor. No, that's done away with. Yeah. Okay, Isaiah 14 and verse 7. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth in singing. So when there's rest and quiet, brethren, the people will break forth in singing, and singing praises to God and thanking God for the fact that we have peace and harmony. We're also here to reflect on the fact that God called us out of this world to be his children, which is another aspect of keeping the feast. In Deuteronomy 16 and verse 12, it says, "And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes." Well, we were once slaves in Egypt, brethren, the Egypt of this world, ruled by Satan, and God in his mercy has called us out of that. And it showed us a better way, opened our minds to understand spiritual things, put his spirit in us so we're begotten children of God, so that at the return of Christ we can transition from flesh to spirit into a whole new world. We ought to reflect on where we came from, our former lives, and where we are going, becoming God beings in the family of God, and not take our eyes off the reward awaiting us, which Mr. Rank so eloquently expressed to us the other day. Don't take your eyes off the crown. That's your reward, brethren. That's in front of us. Not behind us, but in front of us. And it's sure. All you got to do is remain faithful to the end, which, without God's help, you can't do it. But there's a great crown of reward waiting for us at the end of this. And the final thing is we need to bring our offerings. And Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16 says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. And in verse 17 of Deuteronomy 16, every man shall give as he is able. By what criteria? According to the blessings of the Lord your God which he has given you. That's what you use as a criteria in the way of offerings. Notice we're to bring our offerings, and we are to give according to our blessings. And God doesn't expect more than that, brother. You're not to give everything you have and then go without. It's all according to your blessings, and we have been blessed tremendously. Just the knowledge and understanding we have, how do you put a price tag on that? Really, people chase the wrong things, wealth and power. They're God. The world is so messed up. In Leviticus 23 and verse 41 says, you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days, which we're keeping right now. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths, which are temporary dwellings, for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall live in booths. All who are children of God, converted, that's us, shall live in temporary dwellings. That your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. And we must never forget that we worship the one and true God, not some God conjured up by some religious organization. The God of creation, the God of power, God of majesty, the God of salvation. So today we have looked at why we're here celebrating his commanded festival, while the world moves forward with their own little holidays. Most are unaware that what God is doing with his people, and most really don't care. They're too involved in their cares of the world. They do not want nor be told what to do. We, on the other hand, know what God expects from us, and we want to faithfully do what he expects from us. So today, we've looked at 7 reasons why we should attend the Feast of Tabernacles, this current festival. 1 is we are commanded to attend. 2, to rejoice before God. The 3rd thing I talked about is getting here. The 4th is fearing God. And it also pictures the millennium, and we ought to reflect on our calling and bring an offering. So, brethren, if we are faithful in fulfilling these requirements set by God, we're guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed, to have the best feast ever.